So what we're going to have a look at today is an introduction to contract law, and where we have to start with this is the real basics about what is a contract. So what I'd like you to have a think about now, if this is completely new to you, I want you to think about, have you ever made a contract? And in your own words, what do you think a contract is? For those of you who are here to do revision, I want you to write down the definition of a contract and the ingredients that need to go into it. So if you want to pause the video here and have a think about that. So, a contract can be defined as a legally binding agreement, or, and if you want high marks in your exam, I would suggest you use the definition by Sir Frederick Pollock, which is a promise or set of promises which the law will enforce. So that is the definition of a contract. And in terms of the ingredients which go into a contract, for our purposes, these are the ingredients that are required. If you get to degree level, it gets a little more complicated, but we're not quite there yet, so we won't concern ourselves too much about that. But you require an offer, the acceptance of that offer, consideration, which is something that we'll look at in a later video, but is essentially something to put into the bargain. Both parties have got to put something in. Usually one party will put in money and the other will put in either goods or services. Doesn't necessarily have to be that. It could be the exchange of goods, could be the exchange of services. If you go to a bureau de change, for example, because you want to get foreign currency, both parties will put in money. They'll just be from different countries. And the law will only enforce a contract if both people involved in that contract have put something in. The courts won't enforce a bad bargain. So if you say, yes, I'll help you do that, but I don't want any payment for it, then the courts won't help enforce that contract. And intention, you have to mean to make a contract. And again, we will look at that in a later video, but broadly speaking, those are the 4 key ingredients required to make a contract. So what we're going to have a look in this video is the introductory things before we get into the nitty-gritty. So what we're going to have a look at is we're going to create a definition of a bilateral and a unilateral contract. You're going to be able to differentiate and tell the difference between a simple contract and a contract by deed. And in a later video, you'll be able to spot offer, counter-offer and acceptance in a scenario. So first off, we're going to have a look at a type of contract, the most common type of contract. And this is known as a bilateral contract. And this is essentially between 2 parties. So a bilateral contract is one where a promise by one party is exchanged for a promise by the other. And the exchange of promises, both putting something in, as we said previously, that's known as consideration, is what makes these contracts enforceable by law. So it could be for the sale of goods, the buyer promises to pay the price, the seller promises to deliver the goods. And this is by far the most common type of contract. Now I suspect, and I asked you to have a think about this at the start of the video, you've probably already made a bilateral contract today. If you've bought something, if you've obtained a service, so you've gone on the bus, you've gone on the train, then you will have made a bilateral contract. Now there's no need to write it down. There is no need to say anything. You don't need to say, I'm making a contract with you. In fact, sometimes just the action that you take is sufficient. So I suspect that you will probably make a bilateral contract at some stage today. So a little more complicated and a little bit more unusual is a unilateral contract. This is a contract where one party promises to do something in return for an act of the other party as opposed to a promise. So where X promises a reward to anyone who finds his lost wallet. The essence of the unilateral contract is that only one party is bound to do anything, whereas with the bilateral contract, both parties had to do something. So, for example, you see the sign for the lost wallet, you don't necessarily have to do something, but if you were to go and look for it, if you were to give it back to its owner, then you would be entitled to the reward. So let's have a look at how this works in practice. So there you can see the reward poster for the lost golden doodle, and if you were to return that dog to his owner, you'd get the reward. But only the owner of the dog who has put up the reward poster is bound to do anything. If you wanted to, if you chose to, you could just walk past and ignore it. Or you could choose to go and look for the dog. That's up to you. So let's have a look at this example of a unilateral contract. We've got the workman, who's the guy in the hat, and the person that I have described as the landowner, the guy in the suit. So have a look at the really short cartoon strip and see if you can answer the questions. So, the landowner is saying to the workman, I'll pay you $30 to make a stable, just show up and do it. And as you can see in the second frame, there is a stable of some sort, and the landowner is handing over $30. So did the workman have to do anything? Well, no. Clearly all he had to do was show up and make the stable, which he chose to do. And does the landowner have to do something? Well, as soon as the workman shows up and puts up the stable, the landowner is obligated to pay for it. And it's a unilateral contract. Now the key difference between a bilateral contract and a unilateral contract is a bilateral contract is between two people. What we will later find out are called the offeror and the offeree. The one person will make an offer, the other person will accept it, and the contract is only between those two people. So bilateral, bi meaning two. A unilateral contract is open to the world, and anyone can choose to accept it. So anybody seeing the lost dog poster could accept that contract. So bilateral, two people. Unilateral is universal and open to everyone. So an example, really famous example of a unilateral contract can be seen in Carlill and the Carbolic smokeball company. What I'd like you to do at this stage, you can see the advert there, but it's not very clear. I want you to pause the video and I want you to do a Google search for this case. It's worth reading up on properly, and come back to me once you've had a look at the facts of the case. So I'm assuming you've gone away, you've read up on the case, and you know that Mrs. Carlill saw this advert made by the Carbolic smokeball company, which said if you use their smoke ball, which was a sort of round device which you put up your nose, which was designed to stop you from contracting influenza, the flu. If you used it, bought it, used it properly, and you still got ill, then they would give you a £100 reward. And they were so sure that they had deposited £1,000, which if you think this was 1893, that was a lot of money, in a bank account to show how sure they were that you wouldn't get ill. So Mrs. Carlill, she uses the product and she still gets ill. And then she, or more accurately her husband, who was a solicitor, contacted the company and asked for the £100 reward. And initially they said, well, no, because this wasn't actually an offer, this wasn't an offer, it's just an advert, it's just advertising fluff, they described it as. But as you will have read from reading up on the case, this was a unilateral offer. And it was open to the world for anyone to accept, because there was no need to write to the Carbolic Smoke Ball Company and say, I'm accepting your offer, because everything you needed in order to accept that offer is contained within this advert. You knew from reading it, you needed to buy the product, which you did. You needed to use it correctly, which you did. And you needed to contact them if you still got sick, which you did, because they'd already deposited the money. And that's how clear it was. It was clear and easy to accept, which is why this was an offer open to the world, in exactly the same as the Lost Dog advert was. So let's move on and have a look at some little bits of law that you need to know. And what you're looking at here, you don't need to know a lot about these, but you do just need a quick definition. So a contract by deed is a formal legal document which is signed and witnessed, and its impact is to transfer property or to create a legal obligation. So usually a contract by deed is to transfer property. And what you can see on this slide is a real contract by deed. I can tell you it's a contract by deed because I was party to signing this, and it transferred a piece of property. The other type of contract is a simple contract, and these are your everyday normal contract, and it's everything that isn't a contract by deed essentially. They're very informal and they can be made in any way, in writing, orally, or you can just imply them by conduct. So what you've got here is an example of a receipt which demonstrates that a contract has been made. So that is the end of this presentation. What you should be able to do now is to describe a contract in general, a definition of contract law, a definition of a simple contract, contract by deed, bilateral contract, unilateral contract, and a description of the facts and impact of the case of Carlill and the Carbolic Smoke Ball Company. What I'd like you to do to help you with your revision is I'd like you to write a question which relates to each one of these, and then write yourself the answer so that you can test yourself at a later point.